Hello, everybody. I want to welcome everyone. I see that there's quite a few people who are already waiting to start our live Regents review in the chat, and we should all be getting in here. So we are starting a little early, which I wanted to do. I was hoping I'd start even earlier, but that didn't happen. So let me scroll that down. It looks like we're all kind of good. So before we begin the official part of the review, I just want to talk a little bit about what this exam looks like tomorrow. The Global History Regents, and it has a different name this year. It is called the Transition Regents exam. It's very different than any of the other exams the state of New York has ever given. It contains 35 multiple choice questions. It contains one thematic essay, one DBQ essay, and of course that DBQ is accompanied by anywhere between 8 and 15 short answer questions that you get from the DBQ. So that's the makeup of the exam. Also, as you're reviewing, hopefully you've really heard either myself say this or another history teacher say it, but the years are from about the 1700s to today. So this is new. In the past, Regencies have gone from the beginning of time to today. So that means if you are looking at old Regents reviews, about half of that information will be out of date because this is a new exam. So when we do our Regents review today, we're really going to focus on the areas that are going to be on the exam to the best of my ability, because of course I don't know what's on the exam. I'm just making guesses, and I'm in a similar boat to you guys. This is a new exam to me, and I don't have much more information than you all. So if you are currently a student of mine, I am taking out my big giant packet to look at today to kind of help go along. So I'm going to use this as our guide. But if you have any questions in the chat, please feel free to ask them. I will do my best to answer them. I may or may not get to all of them, or I may hold off on something that I'm going to try to get to later in the chat. And we're going to stay for about an hour today. So we're going to look at about 9:15. So that's that. And so without further ado, let's get really into the meat of the review tonight. So like I said, we're not really sure exactly what's going to be on the exam. It's about from 1700s to today. And that leaves a couple of things a little bit earlier, but they're really important to understand for the exam. So concepts from them are going to be used, specifically the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment will definitely see some questions from the Enlightenment, but it's understand that the scientific revolution does come first. You're looking about 1500 to 1600, and it's because of the ideas that the scientific Enlightenment thinkers bring to us that we are that we have to kind of look at. So to understand, you want to kind of look at people like Copernicus or Galileo or Sir Isaac Newton and just kind of know that they challenged authority, they challenged the church, they challenged the way we thought, the way reason is, and the way reason goes about. And then that they ultimately, the scientific revolution leads to the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment will definitely be on there. I don't think you're going to see an essay on the Enlightenment, either a DBQ or a thematic essay, but I think that you will probably see something about the French Revolution or the Latin American Revolution. So therefore, you need to understand the Enlightenment. Emma, I do see your question. I have no idea how many questions you have to get right to pass. Teachers are not informed of that until the day after the Regents. And even that is something we call a scale. And so you can actually go and look at some of the older scales that they've used in the past. If you just do a Google search for Global History Regents, and then you look at last year's exam, it'll show you that it's a sliding scale. So it depends on how many questions you get right of the multiple choice, plus how many you get of the short answer, and then how many questions or how you do on the two essays. So it's impossible for me to tell you how many questions you have to get right. Okay, so the Enlightenment, the thinkers, the key people. Let me move that a little bit. Okay, so flip my page just because I need to stay with us too. So people that we want to know John Locke, and I always talk about this. I am going to get into the French Revolution very, very shortly. So I always think of John Locke and unlocking things because he unlocks our natural rights, life, liberty, and property. If that sounds familiar, it's because Enlightenment philosopher thinkers in the United States also take that idea. I'm not going to get into that because do not talk about the United States history on the global regions. It won't be good for you. You'll get a 0 on an essay. We also talk about Baron de Montesquieu. And when I do that, I like to break his name down into 3 chunks. Montesquieu, because Montesquieu believed in the separation of the branches of power. So the idea of having 3 branches of power, 3 branches of government. And then the other one we want to think about is Voltaire, and I always think about his V, because he separates church and state. So if you have the V and you have church on one side and state on the other, that's Voltaire. My co-teacher, Mr. Benko, I don't know if he's there yet, but he likes to think of Voltaire laying down on his side like he's a guy screaming, because he also gives us freedom of speech, the key ideas of freedom of speech. But the important thing for this Regents for you to understand about the Enlightenment is that the French Revolution and the Latin American revolutions get their ideas from the Enlightenment thinkers. So people like John Locke, who said we should have natural rights, then led people to realize if we have natural rights, then we should be able to handle our government ourselves. So they take on the ideas of the Enlightenment thinkers in their actual revolutions. So the key point of knowing about the Enlightenment is knowing that it leads to other things. Okay, key reasons: the French Revolution and the Latin American Revolution. So when I'm talking about the Latin American revolutions, I'm talking about the Haitian Revolution, which we'll talk about in just a second, and also the ones that take place in South America that Simon Bolivar kind of tackles. So Venezuela and Bolivia and Argentina, those kind of countries. So I'm just going to jump in here to political revolutions is the section I want to go to next. And yeah, we want to know about France. France will definitely be on here. So France, I always think about a triangle when I think about what was going on in France. So before the French Revolution takes place, France had 3 estates. They had the first estate, the second estate, and the third estate. And the first and second estate were made of wealthy people, the wealthy and the clergy. And the clergy is actually the first estate, and the second is the wealthy aristocrats. And then you have the third estate, which actually has 3 groups in it. It has the bourgeoisie, the sans-culottes, and the peasants. So the third estate itself has broken down into 3 groups. The third estate has the majority of people. It's like 98% of the people are in that third class. But the third class has no power. They have to pay all the taxes, but they have no power. And so everyone, as you can imagine, is super cranky. So the third estate wants to kind of overthrow the government, change the government. They've been learning Enlightenment thinkers. They realize if they don't like their government, it's their right, it is their duty to overthrow those governments. So that's exactly what they think about doing. They're unhappy with King Louis, and they are going to take that into a revolution. They do a Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which is very similar to oh, hey, it's Mr. Benko. Hi, how are you? Welcome there too. That's great. So Mr. Benko, for those of you who don't know, is my co-teacher. So he'll be there to help questions. I can see him in the chat. So when I miss something, he'll probably catch up, you guys. Excellent. So yeah, so the rights of man and citizen, similar to our Declaration of Independence, talks about how people deserve to be free and not be controlled by a king. And then the French Revolution goes through a phase called the Reign of Terror. And as the name might imply, then it's not a happy time. This is a time when people are being beheaded by a group of people called the Jacobins, and they are led by Maximilien Robespierre and Maximilien Robitussin. So that and so they kill like millions of people, thousands of people. And we're looking at like on a daily basis. They were beheading people with the guillotine all the time, including King Louis and his wife, Marie Antoinette. So that kind of brings the end to the monarchy in France, obviously. And also Rousseau, or not, excuse me, not Rousseau, Robespierre also ends up in the same fate. He's beheaded by the guillotine. So the idea that he actually threw out there of beheading people who were against the government ends up kind of not in his favor. So he also gets killed. But this then leads for a power vacuum. And someone has to come into play because now France is kind of ruled by nobody. The Jacobins have kind of lost a lot of their power because they were just really violent. The king is gone and they don't want a king. So Napoleon Bonaparte comes into power and he starts to take over France and then starts to kind of conquer throughout Europe. So that's kind of what you're looking at with Napoleon. And of course, the biggest problem Napoleon has is he tries to invade Russia. He is going to learn very quickly that you don't invade Russia. It's big and it's cold. And he invades, and it was wintertime. He invades, his troops can't handle it. And Adolf Hitler, this is a good comparison thing. Adolf Hitler is going to learn the same lesson. So the Nazis are going to learn the same lessons. They're going to meet their defeat by not being able to conquer Russia. So lesson learned for future crazy people who want to take over the world, don't invade Russia. All right, so that is the French Revolution. I know it's really quick. If you want more information on the French Revolution specifically, find another YouTube video, do a Google search. I just wanted to do a quick thing there. So we talked about the social classes. We talked about the rights of man. We talked about the reign of terror, then how Napoleon is able to come to power. Napoleon defeated by the country of Russia, because that's what happens. So now we want to move into Latin America. We want to look at two specific locations, specifically Haiti. So Haiti was for the most part, a slave territory. So the French had control of Haiti for their sugar and sugar plantations, so they could make rum and sugar. And there was a man there, Toussaint Louverture, and he was a black man, and he was a slave. And he realized he had been reading about what was going on in France, and he had learned a little bit about the Enlightenment. And he realized, like, hey, hold on. If France can get independence from France, like if they can have a war against the king, then he too should be able to break away from France. So he led a slave revolt in Haiti. And again, this is a man, Toussaint Louverture. And he was actually very successful and led a campaign. And Haiti was the first, other than the United States of America, colony to be freed in North America. So that's very exciting. And it did work very well. Yes, this will be saved. You can watch it later, and about an hour, like 9:15-ish. All right, the other person I really want to talk about in Latin America is Simón Bolívar. And Simón Bolívar was born in Venezuela, educated in Europe, also learned about the Enlightenment, and he was dealing with issues with South America was mostly controlled by Spain, and he wanted to break away from Spain. So he did, and he led independence fights against the Spanish, and he was also successful. I think it's 16 countries. No, it couldn't be 16. 6 countries. It's obviously not that important how many countries he gains independence for, but Venezuela and Bolivia are, two, just to kind of name two places that gain independence through Simon Bolivar. Again, get more information, just kind of an interesting thing out there. Hi, Malcolm, I see you too. Okay, our next revolution, very different revolution, okay? Non-political revolution, and that is the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution was a change in the way we produce things. So during the Industrial Revolution, first of all, the Industrial Revolution takes place or starts in England, Great Britain, because it has a great abundance of natural resources, like iron, and it has a lot of streams, which sounds ridiculous, but it's actually really important because they're able to use water mills and such. I hope I've got a screaming child. I hope it's not bothering anyone other than me. They also have a lot of coal, tin, lead, all that can kind of help them. So they're in really great shape. And this also forces urbanization. So what was happening was people used to live, if we think of England, small country, the whole country is kind of spread out, right? And then urbanization puts people in places like London or Liverpool in England. So they go into a urban situation. So that is urbanization. People during the Industrial Revolution, really cruddy working conditions, which leads to labor unions and fighting for pay and labor laws and legislation. It also ultimately makes people think of laissez-faire economics, hands up, right? Hands off. Laissez-faire is a French word. It means hands off. So during the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people were saying it's not the government's job to control other businesses out there. So there was a hands-off idea that the government didn't have to deal with the fact that maybe working conditions were poor, or whose businesses were succeeding or whose businesses were failing. That was laissez-faire economics or mixed market economy. Also at this time, and we're going to use this term a lot later, but we do see the very beginning of, well, not the beginning, you see the beginning of communism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels come up with the idea of communism during the Industrial Revolution. However, it won't, so if we're looking at the Industrial Revolution being from 1700 to 1800, the idea of communism isn't going to go into place until 1914. So it takes a while before any country takes that on. And Marx and Engels they're Germans. And of course, the first place we see communists as an actual government being utilized is in Russia. So and like Lenin, who creates communist Russia, won't really know Marx very well, other than through his lessons. So we'll get more into communism a little bit later, even though if you're going the same review book that I have with me, then you can certainly read more about that now. I just want to move on. Next in my book, again, if you're my current student, you know this packet, that's what I'm going through. And I know it's quick, so we're just doing this as a quick evening review. So nationalism is our one next. The definition, of course, is, the love of one's country. The idea that we're going to do anything for our country. And it also could be, it's unifying, which is actually what we're looking at first. During the idea of nationalism, this love for country, or even love for your ethnicity, then it can unify. So it can actually unify or it can divide. And first we're going to look at kind of it unifying. And at this time, 1870s to 1880s, we're going to look at Italy being unified, which is crazy because a lot of us think that Italy's just been Italy forever, and it hasn't. And Germany, same thing. Germany is a new nation, relatively speaking, as the nation we kind of know today. And so in Italy, we have Giuseppe Garibaldi, who is basically the main orchestrator of unifying Italy. And then Otto von Bismarck as part of the leader of unifying Germany and creating them together. And that's really what I have there specifically for nationalism at this time. We're going to see this throughout. So the idea of nationalism, the love for one's country, the love for one's nation, one's ethnicity, we're going to see throughout. We're going to see both the positives and the negatives of that. So some people use this really well, like Nelson Mandela, and then there will be some people like Adolf Hitler who are going to use nationalism in a really negative way. All right, moving on. Let's see. Yep, nationalism. And then we also have here nationalism in Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. This is the opposite. So we saw Italy and Germany unifying. We actually see Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire separating with nationalism, because a lot of the people, so the ethnicities that lived inside of the Ottoman Empire or the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, are going to start to feel secluded, and they're going to want to break apart. And this definitely, like, that's where we see like Serbia and Montenegro when we're looking down at the Balkan region, when we're talking about World War I in a minute, and the idea of what is what's going to cause that tension that's going to create that nationalism in World War I. And I know my students certainly know the four main causes of World War I, and that nationalism is one of them. And I'm hoping that if you're not one of my students, you know the four main causes of World War I also. Okay. And then also another one that's maybe thrown out there, you got some nationalism in Ireland going on as well. So the Irish are going to want to they're going to be very willing to separate from England as well. They're actually going to be one of the last English colonies to separate from England, especially since they're the closest. And you're going to have tensions throughout Ireland up until today, because of kind of the nationalism going through Ireland, that the Southern Irish people feel they are Irish, they are Catholic, they are Ireland. And then you have the Northern Irish people feeling that they are Protestant, they are part of England. So there's some nationalism there. You may or may not see something about Ireland. It probably won't be an essay. I have seen it as a DBQ, but probably not something to be overly concerned with. Imperialism. Again, for those students who know your four main causes of World War I, it's like they're prepping us for it, because we've now had nationalism and we're looking at imperialism. So imperialism is the idea that one country, one strong country, will go into another country to start to take it over, for kind of two main reasons. One will be the raw materials that that nation has, and the second is the markets that that nation would provide. So if we're looking at Africa, because that's going to be kind of the key continent that's going to be discussed during imperialism. If you're looking at Africa, maybe it's something like gold. And so the Europeans, so when we're talking about these strong nations, we are talking about the Europeans. And so the Europeans are going to come into Africa. They're going to take it over. They want something like gold. And they will take that raw material, maybe make a necklace, and then they want to sell it to the new markets that they've also created in Africa. So that is what we're looking at there. And we also want to remember the white man's burden. My students, we read this. And that's the idea that the white man had a responsibility to take over places like Africa, who were like barbarians, and they couldn't handle being controlled by themselves. So they needed the white man to come in and protect them. So there was this feeling at the time that the African people couldn't take care of themselves. So it was very respectful of the Europeans to go in and take over Africa and take all the supply, all the resources that the Africans had. That was like the burden the white man had to deal with, because they were smarter than the Africans. Okay. So that's kind of that's the mindset that you have to think about, that the Europeans were living in at that time. So that's the idea. We also call this the scramble for Africa, because what's going to happen is in Europe, there's going to be a conference in Berlin in Germany, newly formed Germany, and the European powers are going to get together and they're going to decide what chunks of Africa each country is going to get. It's not fair. And it creates a lot of problems as we go on. You're going to notice, like, hey, wow, if the Europeans didn't go into Africa to fix the black man, then the problems that happen in Africa later probably wouldn't have existed. So apartheid in South Africa, the Rwandan genocide, like they probably all wouldn't have happened if the white man hadn't come in the first place. So, start thinking about stuff like that as you're studying. All right, I see we're already talking about the four main causes. We'll get there. All right, so we talked about how Africa is taken over by Europeans, like most of the continent of Africa. Also, you see India being taken over quite a bit, and also China and the rest of Asia. And some places are willing to kind of kick out or try kind of from the very beginning. They're very uncomfortable with these Europeans coming in. Some were successful and some weren't. The Sepoy Mutiny in India actually was relatively early on in the imperialism movement, but was not successful. So the Sepoy Mutiny, where the Indian people tried to take over or take back India from the English, they tried, but it didn't quite work. So that's a good one to look at, the Sepoy Mutiny. That was the one where the English, either on purpose or an accident, were lacing the gunpowder caps with cow and pig, so that they were then breaking rules of Hindus and Muslims when the troops had to break open the gunpowder caps. All right, so then that's what I'm going to stick with there. There are other things, but again, I want to keep this quick. We want to talk about how some countries are choosing to modernize and kind of be very European. One of them is Japan. Japan's going to really make some steps to become very much like Europe. They're going to go through a Meiji Restoration, where their emperor, is going to look at the idea that, like, let's turn into the same way as Europe, which is why Japan kind of ends up really strong in places like World War II in just a few years, because they've kind of learned a lot kind of throughout the process. So the Japanese will start to make some pretty bold moves into the mainland section of Asia, particularly that they are going to try to go into China, and they're also going to try to go into Russia. Yeah, okay, that's Japan. Do I want to say anything else about their ideas? So, oh yeah, there's four main things that they get from the Europeans. They look at European government, they look at the European economies, and they look at European technologies and customs. And that's kind of what they're coming and looking at, which then takes us to 1914 and World War I. Okay, so there are four main causes of World War I. Okay, and they make a nice acronym: MAIN, M-A-I-N. Militarism is one of them, the M. Militarism. Alliances, that's the A. Imperialism, that's the I. And nationalism, that's the N. So that's main causes, the four main causes of World War I. And since we just went through most of those, I don't really need to go into them too much. The big thing would be militarism. So the idea that if I've got one gun, then the next guy's going to have two guns, right? If I've got three guns, he's going to get 4 guns, and then I'm going to get a bazooka, and he's going to get 2 bazookas, and then he's going to get a bomb, and I'm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is the idea that militarism is. So each of the sides or alliances are going to be looking at creating these military buildups. And whenever people have that many stockpiled weapons, people want to use them, which is sad, but that's what happens. No talking in class, people, unless you're asking good questions. Just kidding. Okay, so those are the 4 main causes. And then from here, you need to know that Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and he's the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, is shot by a Serbian nationalist. So we were talking about nationalism, how important that is. So once he gets shot by a group of Serbian nationalists, he's shot by one particular Serbian nationalist, but a group of people are doing that. So that then leads people to fight on kind of his behalf. So once one group decides to go in and, protect Austria-Hungary, then the next group does, and then the next group, and then we've got a war. And ultimately, for World War I, you need to know 3 things. You need to know that it starts, you need to know it ends, and you need to know that there's technology in the middle. So I'm not going to get into all the stuff that goes in the middle. So know that it starts. The main causes, that's why it starts. Then you need to know about the new technologies. So they get new technologies during World War I. Particularly, they get submarines, they get tanks, they get airplanes, they get poison gas, mustard and chlorine gas. Deadly. So we got really, really good at killing people during World War I. That's very important. That's key. You need to know that, okay? So we get beginning, middle, or that there's technologies in the middle, and then the end. Incredibly important to know the end. So the end, ultimately, Germany loses. Austria-Hungary loses, and the Ottoman Empire lose. They actually just dissolve, fine, whatever, okay? But it's really important to know Germany loses, and they lose big time. And they have to go, or they don't get to participate in the conclusion of the war through the Treaty of Versailles. So the Allied nations go to and participate in the Treaty of Versailles, and they come up with a whole bunch of things that Germany has to do to pay for World War I, both physically pay for and then emotionally pay for. So they have to take blame for starting the whole war. If you remember, Archduke Franz Ferdinand shot by a Serbian nationalist, not Germany's fault, but they have to take blame for the entire war. They have to pay $30 billion in war reparations, so money for damages to the war. It's a lot of money. They have to decrease the size of their military. They're not allowed an air force. They're allowed 3 ships. They're a very small navy. They have to decrease the size of their army. So they have to get rid of most of their military. And then they have to give up their lands, both lands that they might have, lands that Germany itself is going to get smaller, but they also have to give up their territories and colonies around the world. So anything they own in Africa, anything they have in Asia, they have to get rid of. So they're out of the imperialism game at this point. So why this is important? It's important because now Germany's really sad, really hungry, really depressed. They're not in a good place. And when that's life, when you're in a bad place, you're willing to listen to desperate people. And so were the Germans. So that World War I ultimately leads to World War II because of how poorly the Germans were treated after World War I. So the Treaty of Versailles is the reason we have a World War II. Also, and I see someone asking about the Russian Revolution. Yes, I am going to go over the Russian Revolution, and that has happened. At this point, the Russian Revolution has begun. So in 1917, the Russians actually leave World War I because they're going through their revolution. And that's their communist revolution that they're going to go through to overthrow the Tsar, which is the leader of Russia. However, I wanted to get through the Treaty of Versailles. I wanted to get through all of World War I first before I jumped into that. So that's what I'm going to go on to. And I almost guarantee that the Russian Revolution will be on the exam. I see someone questioning that. It will. And I just did Latin America a little while ago, so head to that one. That's back a little bit, so you can watch that towards the end. Okay, so Russian Revolution. So again, 1917, Russia is not doing real well. Very similar situation to what was going on in France before the revolution. So the Tsar was like living the high life, had like a nice family. They were very wealthy. Everything was going really well. He had no idea what was going on in the rest of Russia. And the Russian people didn't like that. They thought that he was too good for them. So, and they're not doing well in World War I. They're losing a lot of people, a lot of casualties. And there was also lots of food shortages at home because they were supplying World War I. So people were really upset and really unhappy. So a group of people called the Bolsheviks, the group of people called the Bolsheviks, who were people who had studied Karl Marx's idea of communism, come into Russia to take it over and to create it into a communist nation. And so they do. And they're led by a man named Vladimir Lenin, who promises peace, land, and bread, right? So he's going to go in, he's saying, if I take over, me and the Bolsheviks, if we take over, me and the Bolsheviks, if the Bolsheviks and I take over, then we're going to make everyone peaceful. We're going to give you, everyone's going to have land, everyone's going to have bread. Of course, this doesn't entirely turn out in the way you would think it would be, or that they wanted it to be. And the idea of communism, let me go through this idea at this point, because I just really briefly mentioned it before. Communism is the idea that the government will own everything, and then they will kind of distribute the wealth to everybody. And so everyone should be treated fairly. Everyone's wealth should be the same. And so let's say I have a farm. That farm does no longer just belongs to me. It is going to belong to the entire nation. And so anything I grow on my farm will go to the nation, to go to the people. So everything gets sold back. If there's a factory, that factory is owned by the country, not by an individual, like we think of here in the United States. So that's the idea of the idea of communism, is that the government owns everything. And that's a financial idea, but it does usually come with an idea of government controlling the people as well. So it's not just kind of and financial. So it does come with like political dictatorship normally. All right, so the Bolsheviks take over. They with Lenin, and that is at that point Russia turns into the Soviet Union, the USSR, and they start to conquer or take on other areas of land to be a part of the Soviet Union. We see this even more at the end of World War II, which we're going to be getting into right now. But at this point, the Tsar Nicholas II, is gone. He's shot by the Bolsheviks along with his entire family. And Lenin and the Bolsheviks are now in power, and Russia is now a communist nation, the USSR. Okay. Now we get into what's going on in between the two world wars. So again, I'm going to try to make this quick because we're really moving along here. Nationalism happens during the time between the wars. So again, that's the time between World War I and World War II, where we're seeing two particular countries getting really strong and getting really nationalistic, and that's Germany and also Italy. And Germany is going to go to Adolf Hitler because they're in such an awful spot after the Treaty of Versailles. So they're going to kind of willing to listen to a crazy man. and his crazy ideas, because he's going to say things that make sense to them. Benito Mussolini is going to be able to do the same basic idea in Italy and be able to really talk up the Italians into having an intense amount of nationalism as well. There are a couple of other places to look at for nationalism that go on at this point. You have in Turkey, you have Emil Ataturk, who is westernizing and modernizing Turkey, coming up with this crazy idea that they should all be wearing a hat. No, he's specifically talking about European hats. The Turkish people have been wearing the fezzes. He wants the Turkish people to dress in suits and wear caps with brims, hats with brims, and be much more European. So that's going on also, and that's in Turkey. You also have the idea of Zionism starting to spread, which is the quest for a Jewish homeland. And that quest for a Jewish homeland will unfortunately be given to them after the Holocaust because of how awful things were there. And then I just said about Mussolini and Hitler. Again, I don't want to go into them very long. Yes, that was certainly my Jeopardy reference, Alyssa. All right, World War II. I don't even want to talk about it. I just hope everyone knows it. If someone has a specific question, ask it on the chat. Because we could do World War II for days, and that just seems like a waste of time. So I don't want to go in. World War II happens. Okay. If you have questions, ask them. Or watch a different video. And I don't mean to sound snarky. I'm just saying there's just better uses of our time. The one thing I feel like I didn't cover much in class was the Nuremberg trials. So at the end of World War II, particularly after the Holocaust, the Nazis are actually put on trial, or Nazis are put on trial. Individual Nazi people are put on trial, and those are the Nuremberg trials. So they are held accountable for war crimes against humanity, and those are at the Nuremberg trials. So not to be confused with the Nuremberg laws, same name. So the Nuremberg laws were the ones that were outlawing like Jewish marriages to German people. The Nuremberg trials were putting Nazis on trial, which is important to understand. The Nuremberg trials exist because we still put war criminals to trial, and it's based off of the idea of the Nuremberg trials. So again, World War II, who cares? Well, I mean, care a lot, but you should know it. Okay. Is there a main cause of World War I or World War II? I would say the main cause is the fact that World War II, the main cause is that World War I ends so poorly. And then the spark is that the Germans invade Poland. One of the key things that you could also look at for a cause is that the European powers like the United Kingdoms, England, and Russia were appeasing Hitler, so allowing him to kind of not have to follow the rules of the Treaty of Versailles. So that would kind of be where I would be looking at for that. So again, good. I like the questions I'm seeing. I'm going to move on. So after World War II, Germany is a hot mess. Okay. So they are like in complete shambles. They lose. Hope that wasn't a spoiler alert. Better not be the night before the Regents. So Germany loses really badly. And so badly too that they can't control themselves, meaning that the European and Russian powers decide that Germany can't even be German. So they're going to take Germany and they're going to split it into 4 sections. 3 of those sections are going to coexist quite harmoniously. Oh my gosh, Harry Potter reference. It's like Hufflepuff and Ravenclaw and Gryffindor. They all get along, and then you've got Slytherin over there in the corner, and I'm not in my room, so I am not penalized for that reference. So we have Germany split into these 4 groups, and you have so you have England and the United States and France controlling 3 of those sections. And then you have the Soviet Union controlling the 4th. The Soviet Union runs Western Germany, East Germany as a communist nation. And inside of East Germany is Berlin. And inside of Berlin, they split Berlin, the capital of Germany, into 4 sections. And again, same kind of deal. So the United States, Britain, and France treated as kind of their third, right? And then they're 3/3. And then Russia gets the other chunk of Berlin, and they treat it as a communist nation. So you have this tiny little sea of democracy in East Germany. Okay, so that's kind of what's going on in Germany. And we're now in the Cold War. So this is really important that there's these communist countries and these democratic countries that are controlling Germany. The idea of keeping communism where it is the official act that the United States is going to take on, and it's containment, right? So we're going to keep communism where it is. So communist countries that exist can exist, but we're not going to allow it to spread anyplace else. And that line that is going to separate kind of the democratic Western countries from the communist Eastern countries is going to be referred to as the Iron Curtain. And that Iron Curtain will then come across Europe, and nobody gets to be communist if they're not on the side that's not communist. They all have to be democratic from that point on. And the United States is actually going to fund this a little ways, because they're going to offer financial support through the Marshall Plan to make sure that none of those countries decide to go on the side of communism. Because the United States says, hey, if we keep the European nations that are like in shambles, because the whole European continent was a mess after the war, if we keep them all democratic, we don't have to worry about them going over to the communists. So if they're happy and they're healthy and they've got money and they can feed their people, they're not going to be going over to communism. So the United States is willing to supply them with money in order to keep them democratic. So that's that. So then we have the idea, again, of containment. We have the splitting of Germany, so it's like craziness. What are the satellite countries? So satellite countries are areas so if you have Russia as like the main country, then you have the countries that would border Russia, Latvia with Lithuania, like those countries, those become satellite countries. So they are part of the Soviet Union, but not part of Russia. So they're like little chunks of that area. Okay. We get the arms race coming out of the Cold War as well. So the United States and Russia are the 2 leaders in the Cold War. We're the 2 superpowers that emerge after World War II. And the United States and the Soviet Union are going to build a lot of atomic weapons. And they're going to try to outbeat each other for who has the most atomic weapons, who has the best atomic weapons, who can destroy the world, et cetera, et cetera. So like, again, just like we saw militarism at the beginning of World War I, we're going to see it here too, where both sides are going to build up the power. I do see a couple questions on the UN. So the UN, the United Nations, created after World War II in order to keep peace in the world, so that we don't have another world war. The United Nations have no military power, and they have no legal power either. It's just kind of an attempt to keep the world kind of in its good graces. It's, for the most part, a peacekeeping mission. It does hold trials for peacekeeping missions. So that's incredibly important. The Renaissance in Western Europe will not be important for this, as far as like if you're thinking of like older Western civilization, you don't need to know it. Not on the Regents, 1700s to today. Okay. So that's the arms race. we have a really big problem with the arms race when it gets really close to home. So the Cubans are getting really cozy with the Soviets. The Cubans are 90 miles from Miami, Florida, and they're being chummy with the Soviets, and they're looking to point missiles towards the United States in Cuba. It scares the crud out of the United States. The United States don't like this. The United States doesn't like this. And we start to hold an embargo after there's like arguments over like, are you going to take them down? No, you're not. Yes, you are. No, you're not. So we put an embargo, which is why we still have an embargo on Cuba today, although it has loosened quite a bit. But that's something to know. And that is the closest we ever got to nuclear war as far as a major question that was really loud. Other thing to realize, so we call it the Cold War because there's no military actions going on directly between the United States and Russia. However, we have proxy wars, meaning that they're wars that are not directly between the United States and Russia, but they look an awful lot like it. And that would be the Korean War and the Vietnam War would be the two main ones to look at. Both the Korean War and the Vietnam War are wars for wars of containment. So the idea of those countries wanting to become communists or having a issue of being communist, and the United States saying, no, 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 you can't become communist because we've already decided that we just can't do that. So the United States will get involved in Korea and Vietnam in order to stop the spread of communism. And that's both of those wars. That's the key reason we're there. And they were both have elements of communism still in them. North Korea is still communist and South Korea is not. And all of Vietnam is still communist. Okay. Moving along. We do have some things, some alliances that are formed during World War or during the Cold War. You have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is the side the United States is on, with all the countries that were democratic in Europe and in the United States and Canada. And then on the other side, you have the Warsaw Pact, which are the countries that follow the Soviet Union. So that's good to know. Also at this time, economically, you can see the birth of OPEC, which is the the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, mostly in the Middle East. And they're able to control the oil prices throughout the world. So we see this in like the 1970s and 80s and 60s and 50s, where the OPEC countries are able to basically like grab a hold of the European nations and make them do what they want to because they've got control of the oil, and we've been really in love with our oil for quite some time. Okay, we got about 10 minutes until I've really got to stop a screaming child. He's not up there completely alone, but it's getting kind of crazy. So we're looking here at communism in China. In 1914, there's a civil war going on in China. What the heck is China doing? And Mao Zedong is going to come into China, and it is going to make it a communist country. And he starts this with the idea of the Great Leap Forward. He's going to push for communism coming in. It failed. The Great Leap Forward was like 4 steps backwards. It doesn't work. But he's going to try again. He's going to try again with the Cultural Revolution, where he's going to have mostly like teenage soldiers going around. They're the Red Guard, and they're like teenage thugs. No offense, guys. And they're going to go around and they're going to kill, they're going to tattletale, like, my grandfather's a landowner, or my father's a, whatever intellectual, and they're going to get rid of grandpa. And so that was not a good time. And it wasn't successful. Communism wasn't particularly successful in China as a strictly communist country. So when Dao Jinping comes into place, he's going to kind of loosen the rules as far as how communist it's going to be. And he's going to allow for elements of capitalism in communist China. So he's not going to get rid of communism, which is why they actually have elements of communism still today. But he's going to loosen the rules. And so that's actually really successful for China. China is a country that has economically and socially been able to kind of be a little bit of both. They're a little communist and a little democratic, sort of a little capitalist, not really democratic, a little capitalist. One of the big things in there are student protests on how much power the government has. Tiananmen Square is one of the best examples of a protest where the government went too far, and they went in and they were attacking students who were protesting. Okay. There is so much going on in that chat. I cannot focus. Okay. Decolonization. So I said earlier that a lot of European, or a lot of African, a lot of Asian, but I'm going to stick kind of with African problems. A lot of African problems that exist today or recently is because of the white man's burden, the idea that the white man had to go in and like solve all the problems in Africa. And they just made more problems in Africa ultimately. So a couple of key places you want to look at decolonization. So, and I start this off not in Africa, in India. So in India, Britain controlled India, and a man named Gandhi comes after studying all around. He's in Europe, he's in India, he's like all over the place. He comes back, he's a lawyer, and he realizes, hey, hold on, India deserves to be independent. He's going to do hunger strikes, peaceful protests. He's going to do his salt march. His salt march is because the British were requiring that the Indians buy their salt from the British markets. Remember, raw materials, they need two things. They need imperialism, they need the two things. They need the raw materials and the markets. So what was happening is the British were requiring that the Indians buy salt from them when they're surrounded by an ocean, a sea. And Gandhi said, hey, I'm going to march to the sea or the Indian Ocean, and I'm going to make my own salt. And that's what we're going to start to use because it's ridiculous that we're buying British salt. So that's his march to the sea. And they're going to be very successful. India is going to gain its independence. They do, unfortunately, have to break apart into two countries, India and Pakistan, which do not really get along today. Because India is Hindu and Pakistan is Muslim, and it's just kind of a mess, but that's kind of for a later conversation we're not going to really get into. And so that's that. Then we also have the decolonization of Africa, where, we're going to see particularly South Africa is huge. We're going to see that on the exam. I guarantee it. In South Africa, after the Europeans left, I believe it was the Belgians. After the Belgians left, they kind of left with this idea of apartheid, that the whites and the blacks. So the other thing is to realize that just because the government leaves doesn't mean all the people leave. So the Belgians, actually, a lot of Belgians stay. And they leave this idea of apartheid there. And apartheid is the separation of the races, so the blacks and the whites in South Africa. And it's extreme racism. It's very similar to the Black Crow laws here in the United States in the South, but worse and more recent. We're looking at as recent as 1984. That's when apartheid ends. So we're looking at a very, very recent event. Yes, the Tide Pod. And so Nelson Mandela is going to be the leader of a group of the Black Africans in South Africa who are going to not agree with this. He's going to be jailed for a really long time for his beliefs. However, once he gets out of jail, he's almost instantaneously made the president because the apartheid's ending at the same time. So that is that. Okay. And he becomes the first president. Did I say that? Yes, I think I did. Okay. Then the Rwandans. The Rwandans also go for they gain independence. However, they're left with remnants of their imperialism times, where they were taught that there were the Tutsis and the Hutus, and that was not a thing that that it existed previous to Europeans being there. And this was like a slight difference in height, nose width, and length, which separated these two groups of people. And they're actually going to just go and kill each other. Well, the Tutsis are going to slaughter the Tutsis. The Hutus are going to slaughter the Tutsis. And kind of like huge genocide, like know that one as far as like key genocides in modern time. Genocide time. I'm going to be out of it I'm not going to be doing genocides for too much longer here, because I am going to conclude this in just a little bit. This is also where we see, Vietnam coming into play. Vietnam trying to gain its independence from France, but unfortunately they're dealing with communism at the same time. Okay. We have the creation of Israel at this time, because after World War II and after the Holocaust, Europeans feel really bad for the 6 million Jews that died in the Holocaust. So they're going to give the Jewish people Israel, which is great. That's awesome. However, there were people living in Israel before, the Palestinians, and that's not good for them. So the Palestinians are rightfully upset that this group of people were then just pushed in to into Israel. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap this up here. There is still plenty more to cover. I wish I could stay with you guys all night long. If there's no, you won't really need to know anything about the dynastic cycle. That won't be on there. I wouldn't worry about it. Just kind of checking out some of the things. I obviously didn't get through a lot of the chat. Can hear a screaming child. Okay, so that is yeah, I want to scream too. So that's that. I wish everyone good luck. Mr. Hughes is also, I believe, doing his Regents review right now. So he's at Hip Hughes at YouTube. So do that. I also had, I can put it up now if you weren't here at the beginning. Well, that wasn't it. I, at the very beginning of this chat, had put up a, I can probably find it again. Nope, I can't. There is a live Kahoot going on, which is kind of fun. So get a good night's sleep, have a good breakfast, and I wish you all the very best of luck tomorrow on the Regents exam. Don't be late. My kids, 8 o'clock, but it's a regular school day, so you'll be there early anyway. All right, have a good night. And oh yeah, it's always the question. No, of course I don't know the thematic or DBQ questions. I do think it's going to be on individuals in history, but that's just my guess. Yep, I talked about the Enlightened at the beginning of this, so you can check that out. Yep, again, don't know what the thematic is going to be. I'm going to guess individuals in history. I don't know. Know everything. Alrighty. Okay. Again, good night. Thank you for joining. And good luck. Thank you, Mr. Benko, for helping out in that chat. It was great to see all my students. It was great to see all of you who aren't my students. I will certainly tell Jude that y'all say hi, because he's probably wondering what I'm doing down here. All right. Good night. Bye.